Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. We're joined now by Daoud, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, here to talk to us about what's been going on in the latest in the Mideast conflict. So good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Kimberly. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you first describe what the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is, what you all do, and how you're funded?
Absolutely. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We're Washington, D.C. based. We focus on foreign policy. Our guiding star is the U.S. national interest. We are funded by American donors exclusively. We don't take any government funding, neither from foreign governments nor from the United States government. So we are entirely independent and bipartisan.
It's pretty unusual for a think tank to not have any foreign funding at all.
Well, it's something we pride ourselves on.
So there was news this morning that 3 more of the Israeli hostages being held by Hamas were released in exchange for some Palestinian prisoners as well. What do you see at this moment as the status of the ceasefire agreement?
Well, it's still in phase 1, right? I think January 19th was the start date of the phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement. We're looking at 42 days until the start of phase 2. So now there are, I think, another 2 or 3 batches of hostages that have to be released in exchange for Palestinian security prisoners. Right now it's holding, right? There was a holdup, there was a hiccup earlier this week that President Trump had commented on, where Hamas had claimed that the Israelis weren't holding up their end of the bargain and therefore tried to stop the release of the hostages that were released today. President Trump, as we know, threatened that I think it was all hell would break loose if not just small batch of hostages, but that all hostages would be released. Hamas obviously backed off from its position and resumed the normal course of the ceasefire. President Trump had initially called for the release of all hostages by today, not just the trickle. He criticized that. He said it didn't make sense, but it seemed like the Israeli government wasn't. He went a little bit further than where the Israeli government wanted to be. So it seems like we're back to the normal course of the ceasefire agreement.
Now, there's been fears this week that the ceasefire deal, as you just mentioned, could fall apart. Do you see it as in good shape right now, like it's moving along?
I think there are several factors that would keep it on track. First of all, there's the tremendous domestic Israeli pressure for the release of these hostages. Not least of all, you have humanitarian conditions, right, that are among some of the people that are still being held in Gaza. Most famously, at least in Israel, right, the poster children, if you will, of the hostage deal have been physical children, Kfir Bibas and Ariel Bibas, the infants that were kidnapped on October 7th. I think this is a strong image that resonates among Israeli society. They want to see these people released. We still don't know the condition of the Bibas children and their mother. There are also loved ones of people who are still held in Gaza, and there's tremendous domestic pressure to keep this on track. Now, what happens if the Bibas children are revealed to have been murdered? What happens if Hamas tries to pull out of the agreement under whatever excuses it pulls up again? That remains to be seen. We know that President Trump, again, put on Truth Social today that he's putting a 7 p.m. Israel, noon our time deadline for the release of all hostages, but he's putting the ball in Israel's court to see what the Israelis are going to do, and he's going to back that. Now, it seems like I said, the Israeli government is sticking to the deal as is, rather than trying to shift where President Trump was last week, to say, release all of our hostages now, or the deal is off.
There's a Time magazine article saying Trump bets he can threaten his way to ending the Israel-Hamas war, making references to these demands that you're laying out. What is your take on the president's overall strategy to ending this conflict?
Well, look, he came in, prior to even coming in, he said he wanted this thing done. He wants to get back to the business of making peace deals in the Middle East. We remember the Abraham Accords that he shepherded during his first term as president. I think that's where he prefers to be. He came in on a very anti-war message, be it with Ukraine and Russia or in the Middle East. He wants to make deals. Now, part of what President Trump likes to do is he likes to raise the bar a little bit with negotiations, right? So I think what we saw was an attempt to pressure Hamas, which really has very few bargaining chips now besides the hostages that it's holding. We're talking about the State of Israel, which is a significant military power, a first-rate military power in its own on its own, backed by the United States, saying, get this done, keep this on track, or there's going to be, again, hell to pay. So I think this creates leverage for the Israelis, having that overt backing to keep Hamas on track, to keep the deal on track, and for President Trump to get what he wants out of this, which I think ultimately is a certain degree of peace and quiet in the region.
Speaking of what President Trump wants, as reported here in the Associated Press, Trump doubled down on his plan to empty Gaza. He has said that he vows to empty Gaza permanently of its more than 2 million Palestinians, saying they would not be allowed to return, and suggesting at one point that he might force Egypt and Jordan to take them in by threatening to cut off U.S. aid. He has vowed to turn Gaza into what he's called a Riviera of the Middle East, and to forcibly drive the Palestinians from its land, or at least that's the assessment of several rights groups. What authority, if any, does he have to do that?
That's a good question. Look, I think where President Trump is right now is he's not seeing, was something we talked about even under the previous Biden administration, what's the day after for Gaza? And not only have the Israelis not offered a clear vision for the day after for Gaza, neither have the Palestinians' Arab brethren, be it Egypt or Jordan. And I think President Trump is trying to push the envelope here. Look, I think the Arab states are in a tough position. They probably want to take over Gaza in some way, or at least assist Gaza. The issue is optics. Everything with the Palestinian cause is an issue of optics. How are you perceived if you send in Arab troops, be it Jordanians, some Egyptians, some combination, and you take over Gaza and you fight groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? How are you perceived on the Arab street? How are you perceived among your own population? Are you perceived as policing Gaza, policing the Palestinian cause to protect Israel, especially if you have to clash with Palestinian militant groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Are you looked at as if you're protecting the Israelis? Now, what happens when the President of the United States says, I want to expel all Palestinians from Gaza? Then that same move of entering Gaza and taking it over suddenly looks like you're saving the Palestinians, keeping them on their land, rather than entering to protect Israel from Palestinians. So it kind of shifts the dynamic. And we saw in the meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan that the president had, the king said, we have a plan that's being put together with Egypt and Jordan, and we're formulating a plan for Gaza. So suddenly we're seeing movement from the Arab side of the equation to say, no, we don't need this. We don't need to expel these 2 million Palestinians. We don't need to turn it into a Riviera. There's an Arab plan on the table. Give us some time.
Let's actually look at a clip of that Oval Office meeting at the White House on Tuesday, where King Abdullah of Jordan was reiterating his desire for a plan for Gaza that satisfies all the parties involved.
We have to keep in mind that there is a plan from Egypt and the Arab countries. We're being invited by Mohammed bin Salman to discussions in Riyadh. I think the point is how do we make this work in a way that is good for everybody? Right. Obviously, we have to look at the best interests of the United States, of the people in the region, especially to my people of Jordan. And we're going to have some interesting discussions today. I think one of the things that we can do right away is take 2,000 children that are either cancer children or in very ill state to Jordan as quickly as possible, and then wait for, I think, the Egyptians to present their plan on how we can work with the president to work on Gaza challenges.
So
I want to tell you, excuse me, wait, just please. I didn't know that what you just said, 2,000 children with cancer or other problems, and that's really a beautiful gesture. That's really good, and we appreciate it. And we'll be working on the rest with Egypt. I think you're going to see some great progress. I think with Jordan, you're going to see some great progress. 3 of us, and we'll have some others helping, and we're going to have some others at a very high level helping, and the whole thing will come. It's not a complex thing to do. And with the United States being in control of that piece of land, a fairly large piece of land, you're going to have stability in the Middle East for the first time. And the Palestinians, or the people that live now in Gaza, will be living beautifully in another location. They're going to be living safely. They're not going to be killed, murdered, and having to leave every 10 years, because I've been watching this for so many years. It's nothing but trouble. Everyone's being killed. They're being robbed. It's like living in hell. And they're going to end up having a great home, great families that don't have to get mugged and killed and beaten up and harassed by Hamas and everybody else. And I know we'll be able to work something. And what you just said about the 2,000 is fantastic. It's so beautiful. It's music to my ears. But we're going to be able to work something, and I know we'll be able to work something also with I believe, not 100%, but 99%. We're going to work out something with Egypt.
American presidents have been trying for generations to resolve this conflict. Do you have a sense that something will be different this time?
I mean, clearly something will be different. I think President Trump is all about different. He's broken the mold on the Israeli-Arab peace process, even in his first term. Right? The kind of the orthodoxy was that you start with Israeli-Palestinian peace and that spreads out to the rest of the Arab world. The Abraham Accords were the inversion of that, obviously. You start with the Gulf states and you start to move with these moderate Sunni Arab states towards a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think here also this proposal of taking over Gaza. Look, Gaza is not a sovereign territory. Its legal status is probably questionable. There's not a sovereign state that can really claim it for certainty. There is no Palestinian state really that can claim it for certainty. If President Trump exploits that ambiguity to put American troops on the ground, to somehow create an American control over Gaza, that's obviously going to be a game changer. But even if we go back to this is just a negotiation tactic, again, this is a game changer. He's done. It seems like he's done with the orthodoxy. As he just said, I've been watching this conflict for decades, and nothing's moved. So he's trying to move something by hook or by crook, it would seem.
Just switching gears a little bit to the West Bank, what have the conditions been like there and also in Lebanon since the ceasefire? Yeah.
So the West Bank, since the ceasefire, there have been counterterrorism operations. These are ongoing operations, not just since October 7th, but this has been going on for years, even under previous Israeli governments, including the Lapid-Bennett government. There was the Shover Galim, the wave breaker operation that was there, and now we have subsequent operations. We've had warnings, but from the head of Shin Bet, Onen Bar, this is Israel's FBI, saying even though the number of Palestinian terrorist attacks in the West Bank have decreased, the sophistication has increased, and the lethality of each individual attack has increased. So that's precipitating the counterterrorism operations that we've been seeing out there. They're ongoing. Shifting to Lebanon, there's been a ceasefire in place since November 27th. It's been extended now till February 18th, the deadline for Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon. What we've seen is Israel continue clearing operations in the areas under its control, almost daily operations to dismantle and destroy Hezbollah infrastructure, weapons caches in the areas under Israeli control. But we haven't seen movement by the Lebanese government to live up to its end of the ceasefire agreement, which doesn't just require the Lebanese armed forces to take over areas that the Israelis are vacating, but also to dismantle Hezbollah infrastructure in those areas and to secure Lebanon's borders against the entry of materiel, weapons, funds that would help Hezbollah regenerate. We've seen equivocation from the Lebanese on what they want to do. Where we see statements from unofficial statements in an interview, new Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam saying the ceasefire agreement applies through all of Lebanon. But then he's kind of ambiguous about how that'll be done. And then we see the Speaker of Parliament, one of Lebanon's probably longest politicians and Hezbollah's political guardian, if you will, Nabih Berri, saying south of the Litani River, we'll have the ceasefire agreement applies. North of the Litani River, we'll take the matter to internal Lebanese dialogue, which means that, and this is Hezbollah is part of this dialogue because they have massive support from Lebanon's Shiite population, which means you have to bring them to the table. They're a political party in Lebanon. They were part of the government. They have ministers in the new government that they've approved of in Nawaf Salam's new government. So they're going to be part of the dialogue about what happens to Hezbollah's weapons. And, call me skeptical here, but people tend not to sign their own self-destruction. I don't think Hezbollah will do that. So what we're seeing is a situation where the Israelis are acting in South Lebanon. They're asking for an extension because they're not seeing either the Lebanese acting in real time or the willingness to act moving forward. More of the same old that we've seen since 2006, where the Lebanese are saying, we'll take care of it, trust us. Really, things have changed in Lebanon. When you look on facts on the ground, they really haven't.
Before we go to calls, just could you give us an overview of what you're watching in the coming days and weeks, what concerns you have about what's coming next in this conflict?
So my main focus is Hezbollah and Lebanon. I could talk about that all day. So really what I'm focusing on is the timetable for Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon, monitoring Lebanese action against either Hezbollah or Hezbollah's financiers and suppliers in real time, namely Iran. We've seen the Lebanese, for example, block a Mahan air flight that was landing in Beirut. This is an airline that's sanctioned, that was known to smuggle weapons and funds to Hezbollah. But again, this is a cosmetic action. It came the day that the Arabic spokesman for the IDF said that Beirut International Airport is being used to resupply Hezbollah with funds from Iran. So the Lebanese Civilian Air Directorate comes out and says, we're stopping these flights to change security protocols, but only until February 18th. Right? The flights are only blocked until February 18th. As we mentioned, that's the timetable for Israeli withdrawal. So they're just trying to get past the goalpost, right, of getting from ceasefire to a permanent end of hostilities, so then Lebanon can go back to its previous equivocation on Hezbollah. That's what I'm watching. I think that's what we all need to watch, because all of this, what we're seeing, be it in Gaza, be it with Yemen, Hezbollah is the tip of the spear of this. Through the Iranian regime. If Hezbollah is allowed to regenerate, we're going to end up in this situation. Again, not just in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in a decade or two.
We're ready to take your questions for David Daoud of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Our line for Republicans, 202-748-8001. Democrats at 202-748-8000. Independents at 202-748-8002. We will start with our independent line with Michael in Plainfield, Illinois. And good morning, Michael.
Good morning, and I hope that you'll allow me to develop my point, because I'm disappointed in C-SPAN. This problem in Gaza started in 1948. It didn't start just last year. And this gentleman claims to be an expert. Well, you just had a piece on where 2,000 children might be allowed to leave the area because they have cancer. Maybe if we intervened sooner and didn't allow Israel to bomb every hospital into dust in Gaza, those children could be treated there. If we're going to solve the problem, we have to be realistic. The Palestinians deserve a separate, independent state. You have to put pressure on Israel to withdraw from the West Bank and actually let these people alone. That's going to solve the problem. This gentleman, unfortunately, I don't think is aware of the history, that this actually started in 1948, not last year. Please respond.
I'm acutely aware of the history. In fact, I could probably give a lesson on it. In terms of the Gaza hospitals, let's start with talking about that. These hospitals were not merely civilian installations. Now, normally, I'll put on my lawyer hat here. My expertise is in the laws of armed conflict, in fact. Hospitals are normally immune during conflict from being targeted, meaning you have to intentionally, deliberately, for no other purpose, hitting the hospital. But what happens when a hospital is used for military purposes, as we've seen, as the Israelis have demonstrated through video after video, through uncovering weapons caches and underground tunnels in these hospitals, suddenly they lose their immunity, right? And if these hospitals have been transformed into military installations, I mean, that's on Hamas to do so, who are the authorities in Gaza, or the elected authorities in Gaza. Now, when it comes to the West Bank, what the solution will be to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, some say two-state solution, some say a one-state solution. At the end of the day, both sides have to come to an agreement. And while the Israelis have made many offers, and we can talk about, the sincerity of those offers, but there have been offers on the table. We'll take you back to 2000, Camp David, if we want to talk about history. The Israelis gave 97% of the West Bank, offered to split Jerusalem. Even Arab states, the Saudis, said that this deal was the best probably that the Palestinians could get. President Bill Clinton, who sponsored this deal, said this was probably the best that they can get. We could have had an end to the conflict 25 years ago. And President Arafat at the time said no. He couldn't put an end to the conflict. That was the condition. The Israelis said, we'll give you all this, territorial swaps, for the remaining 3%. Splitting Jerusalem, which is anathema almost in Israeli society because of the history, the connection of the Jewish people to Jerusalem. And the Palestinians walked away. There's another deal in 2008 that Prime Minister Olmert had offered. Also, President Mahmoud Abbas, Arafat's successor, didn't even respond to it. So there have been milestones along this conflict where there have been offers to say, create a Palestinian state. We want to be finished with the conflict. And it hasn't been accepted by the other side. Meanwhile, on the Israeli side, after the second intifada, so this was between 2000 and 2005, a wave of terrorism that hit Israel, and the lack of movement and the lack of demonstration of a desire for peace on the other side, the Israeli will to continue compromising is eroded. And October 7th has put, we could say, an end to that, and for the time being at least. That's totally natural. We can talk about the so-called radicalization of Palestinian society, but we don't talk about the impact of this terrorism on Israelis as well.
Because the previous caller referenced the expertise of our guest, I'll just give a little bit of our guest's background. In addition to right now as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, previously he has been a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, the director of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria research at United Against a Nuclear Iran, a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, also worked as a staff member on Capitol Hill, providing analysis on matters related to the Middle East, Israel, and Iran. He also holds a bachelor's degree in government and history and also a Juris Doctorate, a law degree from Suffolk University. So that's some of the background information about our guest today. Back to your calls. Sam is in Hillsdale, Michigan on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Sam.
Hi. I'm a senior fellow in my living room, and it's my position that Trump wants Gaza to build sandals for the ultra-rich, and for down the road, the second Suez Canal, that's the Ben Gurion Canal, and he wants the Crimea for the same thing. He wants to settle that Ukraine business so that he can build a playground in Crimea. So he's got a resort on the Red Sea and one on the Mediterranean.
And David,
thank you for taking my call.
Okay. I guess there was no question in there. Let's go to Earl in Seneca Falls, New York, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Earl.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. My question is this: why do people think that a two-state solution is possible? Excuse me. Because the mullahs in Iran who back the terrorist organizations in Yemen, Gaza, Lebanon. Why do people think that, because of that, why do people think there's a two-state solution possible? Thank you for taking my call.
I think that's a good question. I think it's the crux of the problem because of the widespread terrorism in these areas. Let's talk about the West Bank specifically, because if we're talking about a two-state solution, it's going to be Israel and the territories it controls, namely the West Bank, Gaza, which it gave up in 2005, but that would be the territory of the future Palestinian state. If we look at the West Bank is topographically much higher than the center of Israel. The center of Israel is basically Israel's seat of government. It is basically New York and Washington, D.C. combined in one. It is the heart of its population. So if you were to concede this territory, this high ground overlooking Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, you wouldn't need sophisticated weapons to shut down Israeli life, to shut down the Israeli economy. You would need some sniper rifles, maybe some mortars. This is kind of the crux of the problem, the trepidation that Israelis have about making concessions in the West Bank, because if you were to cede that either to a Palestinian authority that is not a credible partner for peace, that would then turn that territory against Israel to continue the war through different means against the Israelis, or if that Palestinian authority, as we saw in Gaza, was not able to hold that territory either entirely losing it to Hamas as they did, or if we have a Lebanon situation in the West Bank, right? This would shut down Israeli life. I'll take you to a 2018 paper that was written by Natan Sachs, Hadi Amr, who talk about concessions in Israel and concede by Israel in the West Bank and concede that there's a possibility that what could emerge in the West Bank is a situation that resembles South Lebanon, where you may have a Palestinian Authority, and then you have all these groups, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, their offshoots, Lion's Den, that the Palestinian Authority is not able to control. And from there, you could have a Hezbollah situation in this strategically critical territory for Israel, but it wouldn't be similar to South Lebanon in that South Lebanon overlooks the Galilee, which, yes, it has critical infrastructure, but it's not the heart of Israel. It's not the beating pulse. It's not the capital, Jerusalem. It's not the main city, Tel Aviv. It's not the main population center that would be able to be shut down, again, not with sophisticated weapons, with very primitive weapons.
Tony is in Flourtown, Pennsylvania, on our line for Independence. Good morning, Tony.
Yes, good morning. I'm concerned about this guest, and in general, the C-SPAN guests that come from think tanks. Generally, you say that, it's small donations and funding, when in fact these are sort of billionaire and very wealthy points of view. I'm concerned that I haven't heard a Palestinian point of view or perspective. I hear lots of guests on the Israel-Hamas conflict, but nothing from an Israeli standpoint. So this guest is sort of going unopposed. I think he's cherry-picking facts. I think he's manipulating. I think largely he's dishonest. I mean, the international court, 150 nations have called what's happening here genocide, and that was under Joe Biden and the Democrats with the media helping. And then under Trump, it sounds like we're going to do more ethnic cleansing and we're going to force these people from their land. There is no war. One side has a military and one side does not. One side is people being slaughtered. I think it's really important to go back, like the independent caller from earlier said, that this didn't begin last year. This began in 1948. And it has been a steady land grab by Israel. The people in Palestine, they had an organization called the PLO. Israel didn't want to work with them, so they undermined, sabotaged, and helped to create Hamas. And I think if you don't know the history, and Americans rarely know the history because they listen to people like this on C-SPAN, these think tanks are garbage, it's dark money, it's lies, it's propaganda.
So, Tony, you've made quite a few accusations against our guest. I'll let him respond.
I welcome the guest's opinion. The ICJ has not called what's happening in genocide a genocide in Gaza. In fact, you can listen to the former president of the ICJ giving an interview, I think it was on BBC, saying they didn't say that what was happening in Gaza was plausible genocide. They said there are plausible rights that are potentially being affected. So that's a very different question. If we want to go back to the history, the PLO was a terrorist organization for most of its history. That's why the Israelis refused to deal with it. The Israelis set the bar for not negotiating with terrorists, and the PLO's objective, formed in 1964, prior to the onset of the Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza up until 2005, its objective was the elimination of the State of Israel. Its objective was not compromise. So if we're talking about the history, if we want to go back to 1948, Israel was founded with the imprimatur of the international community. There was the League of Nations mandate for Palestine that was given to the British, with the express creation of a Jewish national home, which British officials have said was for the express purpose of creating a Jewish state in the territory that was known as Palestine. And the territory was demarcated and delineated for the express purpose of creating that Jewish state. Now, there's an ethnic conflict that's going on. There's obviously two peoples in that land. And how you divide up that territory, yes, requires compromise because neither side is going anywhere. What doesn't help, actually, are opinions from this caller that delegitimize one side's rights to that land, rights to national self-determination in that land, and simply take the narrative of the other side, hook, line, and sinker, without actually providing any nuance or any facts. Slogans like genocide and ethnic cleansing, when the facts on the ground do not necessarily support that.
Christopher is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Christopher.
Morning. I'd like to thank Brian Lamb and Mrs. Swain and all the great hosts at C-SPAN. You all do such a wonderful job. As it relates to the topic at hand, I don't know really if decades matter in terms of the history. When you consider the millennia of concerns and problems that this area has brought. I mean, you go back to the Old Testament, Esau and Jacob and Cain and Abel.
So, Christopher, I would like to keep it to the modern conflict. Did you have a question for David?
Well, it's more of a statement. I'm concerned about the floor, meaning President Trump has the floor now, and he's rendered an idea out of the box. No matter, I'm a Democrat, and as much as I may dislike a 91 count felon, indicted person, the thoughts of rapist and all this other kind of stuff that Trump is accused of, this idea is out of the box thinking, and that's what has to be done now. I believe the two-state solution, it wasn't a solution now. It wasn't. They just will not get along. And something else has to be done.
We have heard some Trump administration officials saying that the idea of a two-state solution is no longer realistic. What do you think?
Look, I think what President Trump said during his first term still holds, that it's up to the parties to decide. If one party wants the two-state solution, or if one party wants any solution and the other doesn't, then we don't have a solution. So that, given that we're at a state where the Israeli appetite now for concession, for territorial concession, simply isn't there anymore. We've seen the slow death of the Israeli left under successive waves of Palestinian terrorism. Again, going back to 2000 with the second Intifada. If you go from the euphoria of the 1990s, the Oslo Accords, when you talk to the average Israeli, they thought they were going to be eating hummus in Beirut within months. Right? That this was done. They were finally done. So that euphoria translates into the suicide bombings of the 2000s. And then kind of the end was with October 7th. And the Israeli left and the center, which are pro-two-state solution, have not offered a vision for peace and achieving a two-state solution that is caught up with the times. And on the other hand, a Palestinian unwillingness to call a final end to the conflict, either through a two-state solution or otherwise, where we've seen deals that would either require no end to the conflict, it would be kind of a staging point, or one that would require the return of millions of Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war to Israel, which would demographically change Israel from a Jewish state, its express purpose, into a state with a Palestinian majority. This is not a solution. So we haven't seen this kind of two states for two peoples side and on the one side, and then the erosion of that on the other side, to the point where right now I think talk of a solution is perhaps premature. I do want to make a point about, I think you noted this, going back to ancient history. Going back into history, as our last two callers have talked about, one wants to go back to 1948, the other wants to go back to the Hebrew Bible. This doesn't help us. We are here in February of 2025. Let's start looking forward about what's realistic, instead of sinking these two peoples in the grievances of the past. Look, everyone can sit there and debate who's right till the end of time. And in the meantime, you have innocents on both sides that are suffering and that will continue to suffer in this endless war if all that's done moving forward is to sit there and try to justify who's better based on the past 100 years, 76 years, 1,000 years. It's just not a productive way to move forward.
John is in Louisiana on our line for Republicans. Good morning, John.
Yeah, the thing to me on this is the hostages have to be released. Just not anything else can get done until that happens. And this dribbling along, it's just prolonging something. And I don't know. It's just. They need to they will release all the Israeli hostages, which they are. Now, the Hamas do the same thing. You're going to have to, even though they're not really hostages. A lot of them are criminal element. And until that happens, so it should be just, I don't know. It's driving me crazy that it's gone this long.
Any follow-up points to what John was saying?
I think he's echoing President Trump's sentiment that this dribble doesn't make sense. At the same time, what makes sense and what's realistic are two separate things. I think if there were a kind of a magic wand or a magic solution to solving the conflict, to ending this war permanently, I would assume that, I would hope that responsible leadership would take it. Unfortunately, there isn't. You have to deal with what's realistic. And what's realistic is, unfortunately, this trickle of 3 hostages a week, 4 hostages a week, with the release of, I think today was 369 Palestinian security prisoners, 36 of whom were convicted to life sentences for several murders. That's not an ideal situation where you release innocent people in exchange for people with blood on their hands either, but it's what's unfortunately the only thing that's realistically possible at this moment.
Kathleen is in Dayton, Ohio, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Kathleen.
Good morning, and so appreciate Washington Journal. Mr. Daoud, you said history is not important, but history is incredibly important.
No, he didn't say history was not important. He said going so far back into history wasn't productive for the modern-day conversation. But go ahead, Kathleen.
I hope you object to when others are making your objection is a really odd timing, quite frankly. But Mr. Daoud, understanding history is really critical in regard to this circumstance and how we got where we're at, and also the history of the U.S. Any country's history is really important to understand. So I really disagree with you. And in regard to moving forward, the Arab League, all people can go watch Amanpour and company, who she's been doing the best coverage. I'm a media junkie, quite frankly, in my 70s, and so Amanpour, BBC, PBS, Washington Journal. You are not having guests from the other perspective, like Norman Finkelstein or Nora Erekat or Barghouti or Rula Jabriel. So in regard to the ICJ's rulings, in regard to determining that this indeed has been a genocide, and we have been able to see it with our eyes. And so what do you think about the ICJ's ruling? People should go watch that. They can Google it, the International Criminal Court of Justice, as well as ICC's rulings on Gallant and Netanyahu being war criminals in regard to starving people. And, we've been able to see this genocide in front of our eyes. Talk about those things, as well as the endless theft of internationally recognized Palestinian land in the West Bank. Israel has been incredibly aggressive, and they do have the weapons. So talk about that issue as well as the Arab League. All the Arab leaders are saying, no way are Palestinians going to be removed. They won't go along with it. So talk about that as well, please.
I'm not sure if there was a question in that. I never said that history wasn't relevant. I said focusing obsessively on history is not productive. We can go into history endlessly, and the point that I was trying to make is to score historical points at the expense of moving forward is not what's productive. The ICJ and the ICC have not ruled anything, in fact. The ICC has issued arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. This isn't the same as a conviction, by the way. Even however you view those arrest warrants, the ICJ, it's similar. There has been no final ruling on that. If we're talking about the Arab League,
let's just pause for a moment there about the ICJ ruling, which was from January of last year. I'm going to read a story here from NPR. A top UN court says the Gaza genocide is plausible but does not order a ceasefire. The International Court of Justice has found it plausible that Israel has committed acts that violate the Genocide Convention. In a provisional order delivered by the court's president, Joan Donoghue, the court said Israel must ensure with immediate effect that its forces do not commit any of the acts prohibited by the convention. Donoghue said the court cannot make a final determination right now on whether Israel is guilty of genocide, but she said that given the deteriorating situation in Gaza, the court has jurisdiction to order measures to protect Gaza's population from further risk of genocide. And that was in January of last year. Go ahead.
So Joan Donoghue actually gave a subsequent interview in which she said that those media headlines were misquoting her. These are in her own words. She wasn't saying there's a plausible risk of genocide there. This is in her own words. You can go view the the interview subsequently that she gave. So what's happened there is there's been this hearing that's been brought to the ICJ, and these processes take years. So there's been no definitive determination or final ruling that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. And to say we're seeing it in real time, I think, is unrealistic, because most people who think that what is a war crime don't understand how the laws of armed conflict work and what they permit and what they don't permit.
All right, let's go to John in Atlantic, Iowa, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, John.
Hey, David. I just had two questions, but I just wanted your thought on whether the Palestinians have, a right to sovereign citizenship. And the second question is whether you agree with, this statement that there has never been a sovereign Palestinian authority that explicitly defined who is a Palestinian. That's all.
Let's break that down. So the question of whether Palestinians have a right to sovereignty. All peoples, this is international law, have a right to self-determination. Insofar as the Palestinians are a people under the criteria that qualify for self-determination, then they are entitled to self-determination. The question is whether self-determination necessarily equals independence. Now, if we look at the Quebec case from Canada, so I'm again putting on my lawyer hat, self-determination does not always necessarily need to equal independence. In that case, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that Quebec, because the Quebecois' rights were guaranteed through the mechanisms of state of Canada, through the Constitution of Canada, that self-determination was already fulfilled through the context of the Canadian state. International law has a preference for maintaining the existing borders of states in the interest of stability. Imagine if every day peoples arise all the time, you started shifting borders as peoples arose. So there's an interest and a preference for maintaining the existing borders of states. If you can fulfill your right to self-determination from within those existing borders and within that existing state, then you're not entitled to self-determination as independence, as cession from the existing state. Now, whether there has ever been a sovereign Palestinian entity, I think that's what our caller was asking. There hasn't been to date. The question is, I go back to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in 2000, who was the first Likud prime minister to break from Likud orthodoxy and adopt a two-state solution. This was at a teachers' conference in 2000, where he said, 2001 rather, where he said, "I'm going to give the Palestinians what neither the Arabs nor the Turks nor the British ever gave them: a sovereign state." This statement is, as a matter of history, true. There has never been a sovereign state of Palestine in the borders that are claimed either by the pro-Palestine movement or in the smaller borders that have been delineated in a potential two-state solution. There has been a British mandate for Palestine, which existed in defined the borders of Palestine, which includes Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. But that was not a sovereign state. That was a mandatory territory that the British were given by the League of Nations for the purpose of turning that territory into a Jewish national home.
All right, well, that is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to David Daoud, who's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Really appreciate your time this morning.
My pleasure.